I am not a paranormal investigator. I am an author. While looking for inspiration for a book, I came across a series of stories surrounding a home in the American Pacific Northwest. It is an extremely ordinary-looking house in an extremely ordinary-looking residential neighborhood. But the stories that have emanated from its former residents and the people who lived in the town that it's located in are quite extraordinary. Through my research of the house on Wendall Lane, I have come across accounts that range from the supernatural to just plain bizarre. In order to protect the privacy of the people in the town, as well as the current inhabitants of the house on Wendall Lane, I have not only changed the name of everyone in these stories, but the name of the street as well. Wendall Lane is just an alias for the true location of these accounts. Wendy Hope has been missing for nearly a year. Since her disappearance, the only piece of evidence police have been able to uncover is the manifesto she wrote the day she vanished. It was discovered in her car, over 50 miles away from her home. Investigators kept the letter on a strict need-to-know basis. The story was picked up by local news stations, and before long, rumors were swirling about what the police were hiding. Despite pressure, investigators decided not to release the letter to the public, but in February of this year, a transcript of it began to circulate around the internet. The police claimed the transcript was a hoax until photographs of the letter taken from inside an evidence locker revealed the manifesto making its way around the web was in fact genuine. Given the bizarre nature of the letter, one can only wonder why the police fought so hard to prevent it from getting out to the public. What you are about to hear is the manifesto of Wendy Hope.
I'd like to conduct a little experiment. Please follow along with my step-by-step instructions, and I promise we'll get into the story very shortly. Step 1. Stand up. Get out of your chair. Step 2. Now bend over and with your fingers secure the laces of both your shoes. If you're not wearing shoes, grab hold of your socks. If you don't have socks on, grip your toes. If you don't have toes, I can't help you. Step 3. Once your laces or socks or toes are secure, begin to pull them upwards. Pull as hard as you can. Put all your strength into it. Try to see if you can lift both feet simultaneously off the ground until your soles are floating in the air. Did it work? If so, then congratulations. You have successfully pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. If not, then don't fret. They say this feat is an impossible one. I've yet to pull myself up by my bootstraps, and I've tried many, many times before. There is a silly book I read when I was in high school called The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen. It was written by 18th century author Rudolf Ulrich Rasp. The book was about a fictional German nobleman named Baron Munchausen, who would often find himself caught in ridiculous, sticky situations. Just when you thought he was done for, he would always come up with some miraculous way to escape. One time, the Baron was riding through a swamp when his horse got its hooves stuck in quicksand. To his horror, he soon realized that both he and his steed were sinking into the muck, and that if he didn't do something fast, the swamp would swallow them whole. So this is how the Baron escaped. He grabbed a handful of his own hair and began to tug on it. He pulled and pulled and pulled until both he and his horse were free of the dangerous terrain. If you think that sounds absurd, then you'd be correct. The Baron evaded death by performing an impossible feat. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps, so to speak. Now, let's get into the story. Imagine a little girl. She's 9 years old. She lives in a nice house on a quiet street with her mommy and daddy and her little brother, too. The date is Friday, October 22nd, 1954. It's early evening and the little girl is upstairs in her room playing with Barbie dolls. From the corner of her eye, she detects a hint of movement outside her bedroom window. So this little girl, she turns her head and peers down into the backyard, and that's when she sees something that steals her breath. There is an elderly woman standing in the doorway of her parents' garden shed, staring up at her. This old woman, she wears a long black dress. On her lapel is a circular green brooch with gold trim. Her hair is white and stringy, and her face is as wrinkled as a raisin. It's close to Halloween, and thoughts of ghosts, goblins, and things of that nature have been prowling about inside the little girl's mind for days. She thinks the old lady is a witch. So this is what the little girl does. She runs to Mommy and Daddy's room to tell them about the mean old witch she saw hiding in the garden shed. When she gets there, Mommy is in front of her vanity, putting on the finishing touches of her makeup, and Daddy is fixing his tie in the mirror. The little girl's parents are getting ready for a big night out. They had arranged for a babysitter to watch the kids that evening so they could grab dinner and catch a movie. The little girl cries and cries about the witch, but Mommy and Daddy aren't having it. They have waited a long time to have a night to themselves and aren't about to let their daughter's overactive imagination spoil their plans. 20 minutes later, the babysitter shows up and the little girl's parents are out the door. The babysitter is a young woman in her early 20s. She's watched the little girl and her younger brother before. Both the kids like her very much. They've always had so much fun with this babysitter, and tonight is no different. As a matter of fact, the little girl ends up having such a good time that the thoughts of that old witch lady in the garden shed drift away from her mind like morning mist. Drift away, that is, until the doorbell rings. It's far too late to be expecting visitors, but too early for the little girl's mommy and daddy to come home from their big night out. The babysitter stands up from the kitchen table where she and the children had been playing a game of Candyland and answers the front door. Neither child can tell whom the babysitter is talking to, but the little girl suddenly feels a terrible sensation in her tummy. This, my friends, is called intuition. The little girl's intuition is right to alert her, because a moment later, the babysitter falls to the floor like a rag doll. She's gasping for breath and clutching her throat. There's a gash running lengthwise down the front of it. Blood fills her mouth like a bird bath, spilling down the sides of her pink, rosy cheeks. Standing in the doorway is the old witch. That wicked, nasty woman the little girl spotted in her parents' garden shed. In her hand is a trowel, stolen from that shed. The little girl's mother had used it to plant violets in the backyard just earlier that day. The spade is coated in blood, blood that just seconds earlier had been flowing unobstructed through the body of the children's babysitter. Now it drips to the floor, staining the white carpet a deep crimson. A ridiculous thought pops into the little girl's mind. She thinks her daddy will be mad when he sees the stain. This is because he once sent her to her room for spilling grape juice on that very same rug. The babysitter is dead. Her chest is no longer heaving up and down. Gasps no longer emanate from her bird bath mouth. In the dim living room light, the old lady looks more like a witch than ever. The circular green brooch on her lapel glistens in the darkness. It's the only thing about her that seems pretty. Well, almost pretty. She steps inside and closes the door. This old witch, she does not smile or laugh in some deranged or twisted way. No. Her face looks sober, determined, even keeled. And perhaps this scares the little girl even more. In one of her hands is a rope. This, too, the little girl recognizes as something stolen from her parents' garden shed. The horrible old lady slithers towards the kiddies. They're far too scared to run, too scared to scream, too scared to do anything but sit in their chairs and watch the horrific scene play out before them. The witch says nothing as she ties the little girl's brother to his chair. He's still petrified, but seeing him helpless wakes the little girl up from her near vegetative state. She screams and begins to scratch at the old lady, smacking at her arms and legs, tearing at her dress. She manages to rip the brooch from the witch's lapel, but it doesn't take long before she's eventually subdued. The witch may be old, but she's still much, much stronger than a little girl. After a few minutes, both the children are tied to their chairs. They're in a tight spot. Just as tight of a spot Baron Munchausen was in when his horse got stuck in quicksand. The little girl squeezes the brooch in her hand as hard as she can. She thinks that maybe if she squeezes it enough, she'll crush it into powder, and then the old lady will wither away like the witch in The Wizard of Oz. This, my friends, is just another irrational thought of a frightened little girl. The old woman stands before the children and with both hands gripping the handle tight, raises the trowel over her head. The little girl is certain that she'll never see her parents again. She wants to encourage her younger brother, let him know he'll be okay, but her pastor told her lying is a sin, and she doesn't want to tell a fib moments before facing St. Peter in front of heaven's pearly gates. But then, something behind the old woman stops the little girl mid-thought. There's another woman, a younger one, creeping up on the witch. She had let herself in the side door when the little girl was kicking and screaming. At first, the little girl thinks it's her mommy, but realizes the woman is much too young. No, this is a stranger, and a beautiful one at that. Her hair is walnut brown, her skin as smooth as milk. Even in that terrible moment, the little girl can appreciate how pretty the mystery woman is. This beautiful stranger, she inches slowly across the kitchen until she's only a few feet away. The witch doesn't seem to notice her presence. She stands still like an evil old statue, hand shovel still raised above her head, its tip pointed down towards the kids. It's almost as if time has stopped. And then, just like that, the stranger makes her move. She launches herself at the witch, and for a second, the little girl thinks that the day is saved. This, unfortunately, is not to be. The old lady sidesteps her, almost as if she had been expecting the beautiful stranger, and the young woman goes flying headfirst into a cabinet. The last hope of the little girl and her brother is now laying on the kitchen floor, half unconscious. A massive knot is already beginning to form on her forehead. The old witch wastes no more time. She raises the trowel over her head once more, then drives it down into the chest of the little girl's brother. He does not scream. He hasn't made a peep since the old lady first appeared. But the little girl yells and cries enough for the both of them. She begs the witch to stop, but of course, she doesn't listen. Again and again, the wicked old lady thrusts the shovel into the soft flesh of her younger brother. The little girl can only watch as the light fades from the poor boy's eyes, as his breathing becomes more shallow and erratic, as blood begins to seep through the dozens of new puncture wounds in his body. Eventually, mercifully, he's dead. And then this despicable old lady does something very peculiar. She puts the hand shovel down and takes a seat at the table across from the little girl and the bleeding hunk of Swiss cheese that used to be her brother. She looks tired. The stranger has finally gotten her bearings back. She stands up and sees that she was too late to save the little girl's brother. Tears well up in her eyes, her lips twist themselves into an angry sneer, and suddenly the little girl doesn't think the beautiful stranger looks very beautiful anymore. This no longer beautiful stranger, she picks up the trowel and stands before the nasty old witch, just as the nasty old witch had stood before the children. With one arm, she lifts the spade over her head, angling the tip downward like a knife. The old lady makes no attempt to stop her. Instead, she seems to be waiting for the stranger to take her revenge. But the stranger hesitates before driving the point of the shovel into the witch's heart. The little girl watches on in silence. She doesn't realize it, but she's rubbing the old lady's brooch between her thumb and her forefinger. She can't explain it, but it brings her comfort. The stranger shakes her head, and in doing so, shakes off whatever it was that had given her pause. No longer hesitant, she gores the old witch over and over again with the trowel. The witch then slumps to the floor. Now, there are 2 bloody hunks of Swiss cheese, she and the little girl's brother. This heroic stranger, she unties the little girl, but when she sees the brooch in her hand, an odd expression washes over her, like she's just looked upon the face of a ghost. She backs away in a daze and stumbles out the side door without saying a word. The little girl watches her out the window as the stranger wanders around the backyard for a little while, talking to herself like a crazy person before disappearing into her parents' garden shed. The little girl would not see the stranger come back out of it, even though she kept her eyes glued to its door until the police arrived. Somehow, the stranger had disappeared. I would like to interrupt myself for a moment. I have not finished telling the little girl's story, but before I continue, I want to tell you another one first. Imagine the distant future, hundreds of years removed from the time you and I are currently living in. In this distant future, there is a man perusing the library. Yes, even in the distant future, libraries still exist. This future man, he sees the spine of a book sticking out a little further than the rest on one of the shelves. Curiosity gets the better of him, so he pulls it out and looks at the cover. The book is called The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen. He thinks the title sounds interesting, so this future man sits down and reads the book and laughs out loud at all of the Baron's ridiculous exploits. He finds the book so hilarious that he decides he just has to meet the author. As I've told you before, the book was published in the 18th century by Rudolf Ulrich Rasp, a man who has been dead for a good long time. Now, this would present a problem to you or I if we wanted to meet him, but remember, this man is from the future. He has access to amazing technology which grants him abilities that would be considered impossible by today's standards. As impossible as pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. One such piece of technology is a time machine. So, the future man hops in his time machine and travels back to the mid-18th century. Once in the past, he searches down Rudolf Ulrich Rasp and tells him how much he enjoyed his book. Just before going back to his own time, he decides to leave the author with his copy of the book from the future as a token of his appreciation. But wait! The time traveler committed a huge blunder. You see, he had accidentally gone too far back in time. When he gave Rasp a copy of the book, the young author hadn't even begun to pen The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen yet. With the work already done for him, Rasp then published the manuscript, making himself a very rich and famous man. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why does it matter? Rasp might not have actually written the book, but it's not like he took credit for anyone else's work. That's not the point. I told that story so I could ask you this question. If Rasp didn't actually write The Surprising Adventures of Baron Munchausen, and neither did anyone else, then how, pray tell, did the book come into existence in the first place? Okay, back to the little girl. The old witch was never identified. Rumors began swirling that she was an escaped mental patient, but no facilities in the area had reported any breakouts. The stranger was never located either. It really was as if she vanished inside the shed. The little girl's parents soon sold the house and moved away in order to distance themselves from that awful event. Years have gone by and that little girl isn't so little anymore. She's 22 now, a college graduate, the first woman in her family to get a degree. She has a bright future in front of her, but she still hangs on to memories of her troubled past. They haunt her in her dreams, and lately those dreams have been getting more vivid. The date is October 22nd, 1967. 13 years to the day that her brother and babysitter were senselessly murdered by an evil old witch that was never identified. It's the afternoon. The sun still hangs high in the sky. This no longer little girl, this young woman, she's driving up the interstate on her way to visit friends when she sees an exit sign for the town she used to live in. It gets her thinking about the old witch, the stranger, that terrible evening, her nightmares. She has convinced herself that she needs closure, that she needs to face her demons. So the young woman takes the exit, and a few minutes later she's parked in front of the house where it all happened. Nobody lives there. Whoever her parents had sold the place to must have moved out. A sign is spiked in the front lawn declaring the home is for sale. The young woman gets out of her car and takes in the scene. It looks just how it did 13 years prior. There's something compelling her, driving her forward, an invisible force of some kind. And so, as if being pushed towards the house by a pair of translucent hands, she steps foot on the property again for the first time in over a decade and begins to explore. She unfastens the latch on the side gate and lets herself into the backyard. It's surreal being there again. She gazes up to the second-story window where her bedroom used to be, and once again, memories of that night come flooding back to her. She remembers looking down from that window and seeing that nasty old witch staring back at her from the garden shed. The shed is still there after all those years. The young woman steps cautiously towards it. She doesn't know why. Perhaps it's just her having irrational thoughts again, but she half expects the evil old woman to burst out the door and attack her with that hand shovel. But the witch is dead, and in the back of her mind she knows that. She watched the stranger kill her herself. She watched the coroner scoop her cold, lifeless corpse off the floor. The young woman opens the shed door, and of course, she finds no old woman in it. Again, those translucent hands push her forward. She doesn't know why, but she feels the need to step inside the shed and close the door behind her. Darkness swallows her, but she's not frightened. Why should she be? After all, it's just an old garden shed. She stands there in the blackness for a minute, thinking of the witch and the stranger, thinking again of that terrible night. She tells herself that she'll be able to find the closure she's been seeking inside that shed. It never comes, though. Frustrated, she opens the door, but when she looks outside, she immediately realizes that something is very wrong. It's night now. There are no hints of twilight. The sky isn't just deepening into dusk. No, the stars are out and the moon shines brightly overhead. It seems as if the sun has been down for hours. It makes no sense. It had been broad daylight just minutes before when the young woman had entered the shed. She steps out into the night, and that's when she sees the violets. The very same violets her mother had planted in the yard 13 years earlier. A terrible sensation begins to stir inside her stomach. This, my friends, once again, is intuition. The young woman has reached a strange level of awareness. Her mind understands what has happened, but doesn't believe it. It's not until she sees the lights on inside the house that she can even accept where she is. Or more importantly, when she is. She moves unconsciously across the yard and peers through the window of the door that opens up into the kitchen. There she finds her nightmares waiting for her in corporeal form. The old witch is inside the kitchen, so is her younger brother, and so is she. Somehow, some way, she's traveled back in time. She stares in awe and sees herself when she was just a little girl. She's struggling with the old witch, crying and tearing at her dress. It's so uncanny to relive that night from the vantage point of an outside observer. A sudden series of thoughts ignite inside her mind. Maybe she's not just meant to observe. Maybe she's been sent back because she's supposed to intervene, prevent her brother from dying at the hands of that evil old woman. Maybe she's been given the chance to do what the beautiful stranger couldn't. Why not? Everything up until this point has seemed so impossible. Maybe this is her opportunity to face her demons and change the past. Maybe this is her opportunity to pull herself up by her bootstraps. So the young woman, this is what she does. She slides quietly inside the kitchen, just as the witch has finished tying the little girl up. She stalks behind her, doing everything in her power not to be noticed. The witch raises the trowel above her head, and the young woman looks into the petrified face of her younger brother. She wants so badly to save him. It's now or never. The young woman dives forward in an attempt to tackle the nasty old hag to the ground, but the witch moves quickly. She pirouettes around her like a bullfighter, and the young woman flies headfirst into the cabinet. Pain surges through her skull, and her vision goes black. She writhes around on the floor, not knowing which way is up and which way is down. Her head is hurting pretty bad. Even her ears are ringing. Slowly, her vision returns, and she's finally able to orient herself. When she gets back to her feet, she's horrified by the sight in front of her. The young woman was too late. Her younger brother's fresh corpse sits hunched over, still tied to the chair. His body a bloody hunk of Swiss cheese, just the same as it was 13 years ago. A realization comes to her as she stares at him. The stranger who had failed to save her brother when she was a little girl wasn't a stranger at all. It was her. Somehow, some way, it was her. And once again, she's failed him. Tears begin to sting her eyes. Her lips twist into an angry sneer, and thoughts of revenge started to race through her mind. She turns to the old woman and picks the bloody trowel up off the ground. This not a stranger, this no longer a little girl, can think of nothing other than slaying the evil witch. The witch is sitting calmly in her chair, as if she has accepted her death is imminent. The young woman then raises the trowel over her head and readies herself to drive it into the old lady's body. But when their eyes make contact, she has trouble pulling the trigger. There's something about the old woman's face, something off, something that disturbs her. She shakes her head, breaking away from the witch's hypnotic gaze. That seems to do the trick. She comes down on her with the spade. Again and again, she drives it into her until once more there are 2 bloody hunks of Swiss cheese in that kitchen. Her brother and the witch. When she's sure the witch is dead, she stumbles back across the kitchen and unties the little girl. This little girl, who only 13 years earlier had been her. It's weird to be the one doing the untying this time. She tries to think of something to say. Back then, when she was the little girl, her older self hadn't offered comfort, but this time, she wants things to be different. As she attempts to come up with something to say, her eyes trail down to the little girl's hands, and suddenly she remembers how she had torn the brooch from the lapel of the old lady's dress. A terrible sensation now begins to stir inside her stomach. Yes, friends, again, I am speaking of intuition. It sends her mind into a tailspin. The young woman feels an overbearing urge to run as far away from that place as possible. Those translucent hands shove her out the door and into the backyard. Her head feels like it's on fire, but she isn't sure if it's from the knock she took or from the horrible thoughts swirling around inside of it. Words are spilling out of her mouth, but she doesn't even know what she's saying. The young woman heads for the shed. It seems like the safest place in the world. That invisible force is pushing her harder and harder. When she gets close, she throws herself into the darkness and shuts the door behind her. She shuts her eyes. When she opens them again, she sees daylight trickling through the crack in the door, and she knows she's back in the year 1967. This young woman, this failed hero, still has a terrible feeling stirring in her gut. She runs to her car and begins searching through her luggage. Her heart drops when she finds what she is looking for. It didn't suddenly appear. She had remembered packing it, but she hoped it had somehow gone away. It's the circular green brooch, the very one she had torn from the old lady's dress when she was just a little girl. The young woman takes the brooch in her fist and rears her arm back. She has every intention to chuck it as far as she can, but something won't allow her. She feels compelled to keep it, as if a translucent hand is gripping her by the wrist, not allowing her to let go of it. The young woman concedes. She packs the brooch back in her bag, gets in her car, and sets off again. Once she gets back on the interstate, she knows she can be at her friend's by sundown. She'll treat the bump on her head when she gets there. You could say that this is the end of the story, but you would be wrong. This story has no real end. It has no real beginning either. Its narrative is just as circular and round as the brooch I now wear on the lapel of my dress. Decades passed since that day, and now I'm no longer a young woman. My walnut brown hair has gone white. My smooth skin has wrinkled like a raisin. Anything about me that could have been construed as beautiful has long since withered away. If a little girl were to see me now, she might even mistake me for a witch. I'm not a witch, of course. I'm not wicked or nasty or mean. I'm just an old lady who has seen the universe work in a way that most people can't. There is an invisible force. It compels us to move forward, and sometimes, as in my case, it compels us to move backwards too. Don't ask me why, because I couldn't tell you. Maybe these translucent hands belong to God, and maybe they don't. What I do know is that deviating from the path that is set out for you is as impossible as pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. The date today is October 22nd, over 60 years removed from the night I murdered my younger brother and my babysitter. I'm going back to that house now. I don't want to do it. I don't want to kill them. But I can feel those translucent hands have already grabbed a hold of me. I am nothing more than a marionette puppet. I gaze down at this brooch, and I know that soon my younger self will tear it from my dress. I also know that for some macabre reason, I will feel compelled to keep it as a memento for years and years and years. However, this does raise one very interesting question, of which I don't think I may ever have an answer to. Where did the brooch come from in the first place?
Jacksonville, I love you! I know you do. Hey, I love me too!
Can I, touch it? My God.
Son of a bitch. Not again.
Oh, shit!
We're gonna go to Elk Grove, Michigan. That's my hometown. Then put an end to this horse pucky once and for all.
Whatever happened in this town seems to really haunt him.
Ash, I had to summon you. Help me retrieve the book and send them back to hell.
Oh, you need my help. Here's what I need. I need to be back in Jacksonville on my second keg of beer, putting my spicy man meat into a mother-daughter sandwich.
Part of me is already regretting calling you here.
Get used to that feeling. We gave peace a chance. Now it's time for war.
Die like all the others.
Ladies first.
That is horrible and also awesome.
Which is everything that I do.